Thanks to all of you for coming. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be giving this Royal Institute for Philosophy lecture. If it turns out that the news about progress in philosophy from this is bad, please don't pass it on to the royal family. The question really is going to be about the trajectory of philosophy. And the question of, A, whether there can be progress in philosophy, and B, what kind of progress there can be. It's sometimes said that there's no progress in philosophy, to which there's usually a bunch of somewhat predictable answers. Well, there's progress of this kind and that kind. I think that is setting the bar fairly low, though, to ask the question whether there can be progress in philosophy. So I want to raise a slightly different question. Why isn't there more progress in philosophy? This actually came out of a workshop held at Harvard University a year or two ago on progress in philosophy, where there were quite a lot of speakers doing their best, jumping up and down to give a positive answer to the question, yes, there is progress in philosophy. I think of that as the glass half full view of philosophical progress. Yes, philosophy makes some progress as opposed to none. And I think there's something to that. I think certainly philosophy makes some progress. But all of us, in our heart of hearts, I think if we're honest about it, no matter how heavily invested we are in philosophy and how wonderful we think the field is, I think all of us have to recognize that there are some limitations on the progress that we make. And that's the glass half empty perspective. That yes, philosophy makes some progress, but no, not as much as we would like. So after hearing a lot of people pushing this glass half full perspective, I thought it's at least worth articulating the glass half empty perspective as well to get a little bit clearer on it. And then maybe we can hold both of these perspectives in mind at once. In any case, this talk is largely an exercise in articulating the glass half empty perspective. But let's keep the glass half full perspective in the background as well. The plan is to put forward a central thesis at the beginning on the lack of progress in philosophy and give an argument for it. That's glass half empty. Talk about some compatible varieties of progress, some kinds of progress there may be in philosophy which are consistent with this thesis. I suppose that's the glass half full perspective. Then raise the crucial question of why, if the central thesis is true, then why it's true. That's what explains the lack of progress in philosophy. That's the question of my title. I'll say in advance I don't know the answer to that question. I really just intend to be throwing the question out, and I'm going to be interested to hear everybody's perspective on it. But I'll throw out some potential answers, and then, switching back to glass half full mode, raise the question of whether more progress is possible. I should say I'm going to do this very much from the perspective of kind of a sociologist of philosophy, stepping back and looking at the field from the outside. I've got my own philosophical views about some of these issues that commit me to certain claims. And actually, my first order philosophical views are a bit more optimistic in some ways. And towards the end of the talk, I'll bring those in. But here I want to start by taking a kind of an outside perspective, operating partly as a sociologist of philosophy, not getting too heavily invested in my own or anybody else's first order philosophical views, just to try and examine this situation in the sociology of philosophy about the natures of progress that there are and there are not. So this, in some ways, this will be philosophically superficial. Just looking at the shape from the outside, I think one advantage of that, I think, is this will be something that people can get into without much at all background in the technicalities of philosophy. Okay, so here's my central thesis. The central thesis is there's not been large collective convergence to the truth on the big questions of philosophy. Okay, so I'll say that again. There's not been large collective convergence to the truth on the big questions of philosophy. So, okay, I'll unpack different pieces of that thesis. First of all, what are the big questions of philosophy? Well, I suppose we could operationalize this by just asking a whole bunch of professional philosophers, what are the big questions of philosophy? But I think we've got a fairly good sense of at least some of the questions that would appear frequently on such a list. What is the relationship between mind and body? How do we know about the external world? What are the fundamental principles of morality? Do we have free will? What's the proper way to set up a society? What's the nature of reality? And so on. But as I say, we could operationalize it if we like, but I'll just work with a working assumption of lists of the kinds of things which are candidates to be among the top 5, 10, 20 questions on a list of the big questions of philosophy. Okay, large collective convergence. I take this to require a high degree of agreement over the philosophical community on the answers to these questions. This is going to require a measure of agreement, and ultimately we're going to want a measure of convergence over time, increase in agreement over time, which could, I suppose, in principle be formalized, but I won't bother here. High, I'm going to take to have a certain specific meaning. What's a high degree of agreement? Here the baseline is going to be the amount of agreement there is in the sciences. And a high degree of agreement will be as much or nearly as much as in the sciences. And here I take the so-called hard sciences as the paradigmatic sciences. So let's say physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, if you like, where it does seem that one finds a reasonably high degree of agreement on many central questions. I mean, if you start including psychology or sociology and so on, then I think maybe one can raise questions about whether there's as much agreement in those areas as in the hard sciences. But I'll take, say, physics, chemistry, and biology to be the baseline. So for thesis, then, a high degree of agreement will require roughly the kind of level of agreement on the big questions that there is in those hard sciences. And I don't just require convergence, but convergence to the truth. Here, the idea is the agreement involves true beliefs about the answers. After all, if you had convergence, but not convergence to the truth, say convergence to the false, then, I suppose that would be an advance of a certain kind, but we wouldn't really call it progress. Okay, so that's setting up the central thesis. Now, okay, here's my main argument for the central thesis. It has an empirical premise and a logical premise. The empirical premise is that there has not been large collective convergence on the big questions of philosophy. The logical premise is if there's not been large collective convergence on the big questions of philosophy, then there's not been large collective convergence to the truth on the big questions of philosophy. The conclusion is there's not been large collective convergence to the truth on the big questions of philosophy. I put it to you, this argument has an impeccable logical structure. I hope no one will be questioning its validity. And I put it to you that the logical premise has a certain antecedent plausibility. Actually, I did give this talk a little while ago, and somebody questioned the logical premise on actually fairly good grounds. So maybe that issue will come up in discussion, but I'll at least run with it for now. The real action here is the empirical premise. There's not been large collective convergence on the big questions of philosophy. If we establish that, then I think we've got a pretty good case for the conclusion. Okay, but what about this empirical premise then? That is, after all, an empirical thesis in the sociology of philosophy. How can we decide this? How can we decide this on a priori grounds of philosophical reflection alone? We need to gather a lot of data. Well, in this one case, actually, I have actually gathered some data in my guise as a sociologist of philosophy. 4 or 5 years ago now, I guess it was about 4 years ago now, my collaborator, David Bourget, used to be here in London, and I put together a survey of philosophers under the auspices of the Phil Papers project, much of which was developed here at the Institute for Philosophy in London, where we surveyed a large group of professional philosophers and tried to ascertain their philosophical views. It was done in a very simple way. We just gave them a bunch of binary choices, sometimes ternary, or in one cases 4 choices: mind, physicalism, or non-physicalism, knowledge, empiricism, or rationalism, meta-ethics, moral realism, or moral anti-realism, with the thought that any additional complexities will just complicate matters and introduce additional ambiguities. So we kept it simple. We sent it out to about 2,000 philosophers in leading departments of philosophy, and we got pretty close to a 50% response rate, 931 respondents. That gives you some sense of the shape of philosophical views among professional philosophers internationally. And what did we find? Well, somewhat unsurprisingly, we found a lot of disagreement. So mind, physicalism or non-physicalism, we found 56% for physicalism and 28% for non-physicalism. I don't know whether that will make Ted happy to have as many as 28% or unhappy to have as few, but it's something. Knowledge, 37% for empiricism, 35% for rationalism, a big split on meta-ethics, actually surprisingly high numbers there for moral realism. But actually, one of the cases where there was the closest to agreement was one of the most controversial, the question of God, where 73% of professional philosophers came out as accepting or leaning towards atheism, and 15% came out as accepting or leaning towards theism. Abstract objects, Platonism and nominalism, almost evenly divided. On the question of the correct ethical theory, pretty close split between deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. So not really a surprise to anyone who spent much time hanging out with philosophers or doing philosophy, that there is very widespread disagreement about these things. That is, as a matter of fact, what we found. We had about 30 questions and pretty similar numbers on all of them. Maybe the one that was closest to getting agreement was, what was the question? It was external world. Realism, it was a skepticism, idealism, or non-skeptical realism, where about 80% came out for non-skeptical realism about the external world, and only 4 or 5% were skeptics, and 4 or 5% were idealists. Maybe that's the fashion of the day, and it'll move back. Skepticism and idealism will get their day in the sun once again. In any case, though, most questions, large degree of disagreement. Okay, so there's some support for the empirical premise. It's certainly not exhaustive, conclusive support for the empirical premise, as stated it. Strictly speaking, we'd need a lot more data in the sociology of philosophy. I mean, partly there's a thesis about convergence here. Convergence is a cross-time thesis. So strictly speaking, we'd also need results from the Phil Papers survey from not just 2009, but 1909, 1809, 1709, 1609, 1009, the year 9, and so on, 91 BC, I guess. Asking the philosophers of all these times, first, what are the big questions of philosophy? Because after all, views on that may change. And second, what are the answers to those questions? So we could find, for example, what were the big questions of philosophy in 1609, according to people then, and how much agreement do we have on those now? That's particularly relevant to convergence. And the thesis makes a comparative claim, comparison to the sciences in particular. So I suppose we'd need to take a bunch of other surveys, the Phys Papers survey for physics, and the Chem Papers survey for chemistry, and the Bio Papers survey for biology. And then we'd have to compare the results. For example, I suppose one natural way to do this would be to pick some date in the past, like say 1609, and ask the philosophers of 1609 what are the big questions of philosophy, and ask the physicists of 1609 what are the big questions of physics, and then see in 2009 how much agreement there is on the big questions of physics in 1609 among the physicists of 2009 and compare that to how much agreement there is on the big questions of philosophy in 1609 among the philosophers of 2009. Prediction: less convergent for philosophy than for physics, or than for biology, or for chemistry, and so on. Now, I can't claim to have established that empirically. Most people seem to find it fairly plausible. I mean, there's not universal agreement on this. I've heard some people raise some questions about it, but I think most people find this fairly plausible. Some people think it's just totally obvious. In any case, I'm going to take the empirical premise as granted for now, and go on to think about what follows. Okay, one question you might raise before going further is, why does collective agreement actually matter in philosophy? Why does this sociological fact of collective agreement matter? Well, for a start, we care about knowledge, I think, in philosophy. We care about knowing the truth. I think we care about knowing the truth collectively. We care about collective knowledge of the truth. One thing that science seems to do is to generate collective knowledge. It enables us to know about, the properties of matter and the fundamental laws of nature, have certain kinds of collective knowledge. And in philosophy, we're after the truth too. I think we're aiming for, we would like a certain kind of collective knowledge. And it's very plausible that collective agreement, a certain kind of collective agreement, is a condition. It's a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition, but a necessary condition for collective knowledge. Without sufficient collective agreement on certain questions, at least among experts who have considered the questions and so on, then we plausibly don't have collective knowledge. If just one person knows the truth and a bunch of other people with equal standing disagree, and so on, then maybe one person has knowledge, maybe, but we don't have collective knowledge, and we care about collective knowledge. So in the absence of this kind of collective convergence, it really raises serious questions about whether we have collective knowledge in philosophy. Now, the central thesis I've articulated is a thesis about a certain kind of lack of progress in philosophy, the lack of a certain kind of progress in philosophy, at least compared to other fields. It's consistent with there being other forms of progress. So the central thesis was there's not been large collective convergence to the truth on the big questions of philosophy. This thesis is consistent with many weaker forms of progress. We can obtain those weaker forms by dropping elements in the central thesis. This builds in a bunch of things. All you've got to do is drop out different things one at a time, and you can get to various forms of progress that this thesis is consistent with. So if you want to, again, take the glass half full perspective, even while accepting this thesis, you can see different options for taking a glass half full perspective by dropping different elements. So I'll just consider a few of those ways now and what follows. And one thing you might do is just drop large. At least there's been small convergence to the truth on the big questions of philosophy. Well, incidentally, one thing that maybe it's worth doing is thinking about large convergence as kind of an average measure of convergence across a whole bunch of different questions. And at least the average convergence is going to be fairly small, but that's going to be consistent with large convergence on a few questions and maybe some small convergence on some other questions. So it may turn out that on some small number of questions there's been major convergence. For example, on the question of God, there seems to at least have been a certain major shift on that question towards theism, away from theism and towards atheism. Whether you take that to be convergence to the truth is, of course, going to depend on your own philosophical views. Maybe on certain questions, like certain basic questions of logic, there's a very high degree of agreement that there wasn't many hundreds of years ago. So maybe there's going to be major convergence on a few questions. It's consistent with the thesis, and minor convergence on some other questions. So maybe on the question of physicalism versus non-physicalism, there's been a certain convergence over the last few hundred years, at least a certain increase in views towards a certain increase in the collective views of the community in the direction of physicalism and away from non-physicalism. Again, whether you take that to be convergence to the truth is going to be debatable, and maybe the people on this side of the table will have their own views. Will have their own views about that. But in any case, that's the degrees here are relatively minor compared to the degrees in the sciences, and coming out with a 56 to 28 split. And the thought is, one comes out with on many of the central questions in the sciences, one comes out with much more definite results than that. But still, non-large convergence to the truth is one form of glass half full progress. You might drop collective and instead say, why do we care so much about collective convergence to the truth? Maybe there can be individual convergence to the truth or local convergence to the truth on the big questions of philosophy. I mean, speaking for myself, I can assure you that I have made major progress and major convergence to the truth over my time in philosophy. From age 0 to age 47, I've converged to the truth on almost every major question of philosophy. There are still one or two that still need some figuring out. However, it's an unfortunate but demonstrable fact that this has not led to collective convergence to the truth. The world has, alas, for the most part, not followed, and this is the fate of most philosophers. Maybe some have had a bit more success in this, but usually not for terribly long, and not beyond a certain locale. There are some local groups, where there's certain kinds, at least, of convergence, and maybe some of them have even got lucky enough that they've converged to the truth on some questions. Maybe the Vienna Circle had some local convergence, or maybe the Oxford Realists had some local convergence, or maybe here in the Royal Institute for Philosophy there's been some serious local convergence. But whatever there has been, it hasn't seemed to lead to community-wide convergence. And maybe even in cases where there has been temporarily a kind of a convergence among the whole international philosophical community, such as it is, even to some reasonably large extent, it hasn't lasted. I mean, someone pointed to me, among the medievals, there was some reasonable degree of convergence on some questions for some time. Maybe that was convergence to the truth, but again, it wasn't robust. It didn't last. And again, that seems to be the fate of philosophers. We can drop on the big questions and make the case there's large collective convergence to the truth on certain smaller questions in philosophy. You might say, those big questions, by their nature, they're kind of intractable, but look at all the things we make progress on. Well, we're not making progress on those. There are at least spin-offs, and we make progress on some smaller theses. So, some people like to point to David Lewis. He had a proof. He proved a result about the probabilities of conditionals not being the same as conditional probabilities. Well, that's progress. And indeed, I think there was a certain sort of progress. But I don't think anyone's going to say that, the analysis of probabilities of conditionals is itself one of the big questions of philosophy. Maybe medium-sized, small to medium-sized question. I don't want to poo-poo it, but it's not the mind-body problem. Maybe there's been progress on some questions in logic. Progress on certain negative theses. We're very good at ruling out certain theses, especially certain specific forms of theses as intractable. We're good with conditional theses. If you're going to be a materialist and accept this, then you have to accept that, and so on. So those are all small forms of progress that don't require convergence on the big questions. There's also the phenomenon that subfields often split off from philosophy when they make enough progress, when they come up with tractable methods that lead to certain kinds of convergence. So there's this observation that as soon as you start making that kind of progress, then you don't call it philosophy anymore. This has arguably happened with logic, with physics, with psychology, with formal semantics most recently, and so on. I think that's a form of, you might say, that's a certain form of progress we have on the questions of, say, of 1609. But it's worth answering that often what's going on in these fields is not necessarily answering the truly big philosophical questions. Again, psychology has made a lot of progress, but it hasn't solved the mind-body problem. Formal semantics has made progress, but hasn't exactly resolved the questions of the nature of meaning, and so on. Importantly, we could also drop convergence to the truth. Some people say, what's this obsession with truth? Anyway, or with knowledge and philosophy. There's all kinds of things philosophy can do for us, even if it doesn't give us knowledge, even if it doesn't get us to the truth. So there's all kinds of progress consistent with the absence of convergence to the truth. Increased understanding of the underlying issues, for example, resolving the central issues on which the mind-body problem or the problem of free will or the questions of ethics turn. That's something that philosophers seem to be quite good at. Exploration of possibilities, understanding the space of views, and every now and then developing new views, new areas of philosophical space that we hadn't yet explored. That's a form of philosophical progress. Every now and then, we get to ask a whole new question that nobody had asked before. That's a form of progress in philosophy. Then there's progress on other dimensions too, like actually making a difference to the world, a form of progress that philosophy can be intimately involved with. And I think I want to acknowledge that all these forms of progress are possible. I don't want to exclude them as progress. I think we should be pluralists about progress. As this is importantly, I'm not saying that convergence to the truth and collective knowledge is the only sort of philosophical progress that counts. I think there's lots of things that we can count as progress in philosophy, and we shouldn't diminish these other sorts at least too much. There are many sorts of progress that we do make, but I think collective knowledge, convergence to the truth is one sort of progress, and it is a sort that we care about a great deal. Many of us get into philosophy to get at the truth, to find out the truth about the mind, about free will, about reality, about morality, and so on. If it turns out that we're not doing so well at that, then that's a goal of ours, then that's at least something that we have to seriously worry about. So there's only one sort of progress, but I think it's an important sort. I mean, one reaction, of course, to all this is to say you shouldn't get so hung up on truth in philosophy or on knowledge in philosophy. And you might say, we should just give up on that goal and reconceive philosophy as something else, a Wittgensteinian form of therapy or some such. But I think many of us aren't prepared to go that far. So in the philosophy of mind, for example, just to illustrate the situation, there's been enormous progress in the last century of certain kinds. Convergence on certain small questions and among sub-communities, much increased understanding. Here in London over the last decade or two, say our understanding of the philosophy of perception has been massively increased, and these naive realist and disjunctivist views that are very terribly popular around here, and a massively sophisticated increase in understanding of these things and many related things. I think that does involve much increased understanding, but it does not appear to have led to large collective convergence to the truth. Well, actually, on the Phil Papers survey, it did appear that there was a lot of local convergence among people in London on the question of disjunctivism. That got up there quite high, but it didn't seem to be, once again, sadly, it didn't seem to be reflected in convergence elsewhere. And even within London, to be honest, the convergence was somewhat limited. It was about 3 times as high as anywhere else, but that was still only about 20%. But in any case, it doesn't appear to have been large collective convergence on the big questions in the philosophy of mind. So the mind-body problem is about as wide open as it ever was, or the nature of intentionality, or questions about mental causation, or free will, or the unity of consciousness. If you count those, I think the disagreement is largely as rife as ever. So, okay, this then gets to the question of explanation. Why isn't there more convergence in philosophy? That's the question of my title. What explains the relative lack of convergence in philosophy compared to science, mathematics, and so on? Well, I don't have a complete answer to this question, as I said, but at least got a partial answer to the question to start with, or at least an articulation of the phenomenon that I hope rings true to many people. And at least the first step, I think, is to acknowledge something about the method in philosophy seems to be relatively powerless in compelling agreement across practitioners. So science and mathematics have methods that seem to have the ability to compel agreement across practitioners. Philosophy has a method, the method of argument. It's a wonderful method, but it doesn't seem to have that property, at least on a widespread scale. It doesn't seem to have the ability to compel agreement across practitioners in a widespread number of important cases. What is the difference between these methods here? Okay, so the question is, what is it about argument as opposed to experiment and proof that means it doesn't seem to have this ability to compel agreement? Well, science and mathematics have the property that they start from widely agreed premises. You know, observation, most obviously, in the case of science. Axioms, in the case of mathematics. Premises, for the most part, there's not too much disagreement about. And proceed from there to strong conclusions via steps of reasoning that, you know, are often fairly widely accepted too. But premises like that rarely get us far in philosophy. I mean, you can make philosophical arguments that start from mathematical axioms and from observation alone, but just that much usually doesn't get you to a point of settling the philosophical questions. You always need to combine things like observational and formal premises with strong philosophical premises to get somewhere in philosophy. And those premises can usually easily be denied. So most arguments for strong conclusions in philosophy have premises that opponents can deny without too much cost. So I guess it was Russell who said that the aim of philosophy is to start from premises so obvious that no one could deny them and come to conclusions so outrageous that no one could have dreamed that they were true. And all of us have tried to do this, and every now and then we think we've succeeded, right? But it never happens. It always turns out that somewhere in that argument is a premise that people end up denying without too much discomfort. Sometimes there's a little bit of discomfort. Sometimes there's a premise that even your opponents will acknowledge had a certain antecedent plausibility. So there's a little cost in denying it. So maybe the denial is antecedently surprising, but it's usually perfectly tenable. And the opponents simply take themselves now to have clarified the commitments of their views. Okay, I have to reject that premise, but I'm perfectly happy and comfortable to do so. As they say, one person's modus ponens is another person's modus tollens. And one's opponents are often perfectly happy to do the modus tollens. And it's just a much more comfortable thing to do in philosophy than, say, in science or mathematics, where one would have to deny an observational claim or a mathematical claim. So in effect, philosophical arguments seem not to lead to agreement, but to sophisticated disagreement. We refute bad versions of views. That thesis combined with that antecedently, one's opponent's thesis combined with that antecedently plausible premise, yielding more sophisticated versions. The more sophisticated versions where they realize the commitments that they have to take on. So all the parties recognize the commitments they need to take on to avoid the arguments. So I think of this as a kind of gradual, fragmented elimination of philosophical space. It's kind of fractalization of philosophy. A big space of views. Think of it, there's a fractal that corresponds to all the areas of philosophical space that are left open by the decent arguments which are out there. And arguments can, so you've got physicalism on one side and dualism on another. Maybe a certain argument will refute certain versions of physicalism or certain versions of dualism, those that combine them with certain premises, say about mental causation or about conceivability and possibility or whatever, but large amounts of space on either side of the line are left open by these arguments. And then it gets more and more sophisticated again. More arguments come in. We eliminate this bit of space. We eliminate this bit of space. But it's very rare that the whole side of one line in philosophy is eliminated by these arguments, at least as a matter of sociological fact. It's arguable that, and one sees the same phenomenon repeated on every stage with the combination of philosophical views. With this fragment, materialism divides into, well, okay, you could be the type A materialist or a type B materialist or a type C or a type this or that, and then there's the two different ways to do that, and the two different ways we get this increasingly scholastic division of space. But it's arguable that if it's not everywhere dense, there's at least many, many points in the space where it becomes just increasingly dense, and hardly anything gets eliminated in a giant chunk. So this is not to say that sometimes people put this by saying that one's opponents often are inclined to say, by saying, your argument is question begging because I deny your premise. Or you might think that this suggests that philosophy is dialectically powerless, or these arguments can't produce knowledge. I think all of those claims would be too strong. Nothing about what I've said entails that. The fact that, for example, in many of these cases you've got a premise with some antecedent pre-theoretical support means that the arguments in question, in those cases, the arguments will not be question begging. They even have some dialectical power. Maybe if someone was initially on the fence, arguments like this have the power to bring somebody rationally down on one side of the fence. That's important. That's a form of dialectical power. But they're not so powerful that they compel widespread agreement. It may even be that some people here are getting things right and have knowledge, and other people here are not. So those are all virtues that philosophical arguments, I think, may well have. But they don't seem to have the virtue of compelling widespread agreement. You might think, okay, well, maybe that's so for certain kinds of methods in philosophy. Maybe for scholastic, analytic, a priori philosophy as traditionally practiced, and there have been any number of new methods which have been developed in philosophy, at least some of which have been put forward as having the power to resolve this, this bankrupt method of the old philosophy and to finally enable us to make progress. Going back to the start of last century, the analysis of language was put forward as a massive revolution in philosophy that was going to lead to all kinds of progress. Over the course of, especially in the second half of the 20th century, empirical philosophy was, philosophy seriously grounded in the sciences was put forward as a method that was going to get us past this situation. The phenomenological method is sometimes put forward in this tone of voice. Formal philosophy, especially recently, is often being put forward as, if we're sufficiently rigorous about the underlying formal details, we'll get places. Then there are projects such as the projects of feminist philosophy, of attention to underlying values associated with gender and sex, will lead us to reveal certain presuppositions that we may be able to get beyond and make some progress with. Cross-cultural philosophy, insights from other philosophical traditions in, say, Asia or Africa or South America, maybe will give us the data we need. Most recently, experimental philosophy has been put forward as a new method that may help us get somewhere. All of these, I think, have led to many new insights. Speaking for myself, I'm a kind of a method junkie. A new method comes along and someone starts talking about this. Okay, well, that's really interesting. And I want to say, okay, where exactly is this going to get us? And again, I think all these methods have led to new insights, new kinds of understanding, new openings up of philosophical space, many of those non-truth related virtues. But they demonstrably have not led to convergence. None of these methods have led to convergence. And I think what goes on in all these cases is the same phenomenon we saw before. Empirical premises or formal premises alone, or phenomenological premises alone, or linguistic premises alone are not, at least the uncontroversial premises, are simply not strong enough to settle the key, deep philosophical issues. It's almost always the case that when you apply formal philosophy, you need a philosophical premise in the background that bridges the formal work with the strong philosophical conclusion, and that the philosophical premise normally turns out to be about as controversial as the relevant conclusion. Same for empirical philosophy. An uncontroversial scientific claim very rarely settles a philosophical issue. Maybe we can find one or two cases where it looks fairly good, but most of the time we need another premise, a bridging premise that turns out to be just about as controversial and that does the work. And those premises turn out to be very easy for opponents to deny. So all of these methods have just led us to more sophisticated versions of old disagreement in philosophy. That sophistication is itself a kind of progress, but again, It's not one that's led to collective knowledge. So I think if we're honest about this, at least from my own perspective, this really is it's a disappointment. It's maybe the largest disappointment for me in the practice of philosophy. You know, you get into philosophy as someone just starting out. I got into philosophy as someone just starting out, thinking, you're all gung-ho, and you're thinking, okay, we're going to get somewhere. There's these questions, the mind-body problem, or the problem of free will, or the nature of morality. There are questions here. They have answers, and it ought to be possible to find them. And that once you actually start doing philosophy and putting together a philosophical argument, it's very frequently with the phenomenology of, well, this is getting somewhere. And, people are finally going to see it. And, this argument really has some serious, rationally persuasive dialectical power that ought to be getting us to the truth. At least that's something one hopes for at the beginning of the day. Now, after a little while, one becomes familiar enough with the practice of philosophy that one no longer expects this to happen with one argument. But at least antecedently, you might have hoped that philosophical argument would have that power to produce widespread agreement. And the fact that we've come to recognize that, well, it doesn't, and that we've lowered our expectations, well, it's a lowering of the expectations, I think reflects a kind of disappointment. And of course, professional philosophy becomes very sophisticated. In practice, we settle for something less. People do, by and large, recognize good arguments. There's some kind of consensus on at least what's a powerful argument. We settle for having a powerful argument. People say, okay, well, there are some costs in denying the premises, and as a community, we can recognize good arguments. But even good arguments at that level of assessment don't seem to lead to agreement. And we've gotten used to that, but I think we should recognize that as a kind of a disappointment. Okay. So that's at the beginning of an explanation of why isn't there more progress in philosophy. But it's not that much more than an articulation of the phenomenon, really. So why is it that philosophical argument is relatively powerless in this way? Why doesn't philosophical argument lead to agreement? So here I just want to say a little bit more in the way of putting forward some potential explanations here, none of which seem to me to be fully satisfactory, and to throw it open to you to put forward some other potential explanations. I mean, one line you can take is anti-realism. There's simply no truth to be had in the relevant domain. If there's no truth for the matter, say, about which actions are right and which actions are wrong, then we shouldn't be too surprised that there's no methods to get us to the truth. And it would also provide a natural explanation of why there's no convergence, because the truth doesn't get to play its role as an attractor in convergence. And many of us are anti-realists about something. But I think few of us are, global anti-realists. And it's very hard to take the anti-realist line on, some of the central questions about philosophy. Say, for example, the question between the physicalist and the dualist could really be an issue about which there's no fact of the matter. Well, that's certainly a hard road to hoe. Some questions. Another line is that philosophy is full of verbal disputes. And in many of the big questions of philosophy, proponents are just talking past each other. And if we discipline the use of language enough, we'd be able to get past these disagreements. So I've got a lot of sympathy for this line myself, and I've written on the dissolution of verbal disputes as a way of making certain kinds of philosophical progress. I do think there are lots of verbal disputes in philosophy, and we ought to, and that dissolving them can help us to get somewhere. I am inclined to think, though, that the most fundamental disputes in philosophy are rarely of this nature. That if you get back to those really big questions about the mind-body problem or right and wrong and so on, it's fairly implausible that at fundamental, there are always verbal disputes you at least have to get past, but I think it's pretty plausible that the most fundamental issues are not going to be resolvable in this way. I mean, of course, the logical empiricists held a stronger version of this thesis, but I think that's been shown to be somewhat implausible over time. There's the self-selection idea, that when there's sufficiently widespread agreement on the answer to a question, it ceases to be counted as a philosophical question. I mentioned that one earlier, and I mean, you might try putting that forward as an answer to the question of why there's not convergence in philosophy, because philosophy is by definition, in a sense, the set of questions on which there's not convergence on. It ends up being a kind of a conceptual truth that, that philosophy doesn't involve convergence. I think maybe there's something to this. At the same time, if you think about how we formulated the issue at the beginning, I think this can't be all that's going on. For example, just if we formulate the issue in terms of agreement in philosophy in 2009 on the big questions of philosophy in 1609, then okay, maybe it's happened since then that certain questions, certain philosophical questions of 1609 have attracted convergence. Maybe some questions about space and time, for example, have become part of physics, and therefore no longer counted as big questions of philosophy. Still, I submit to you it's plausible that, at least if I'm correct, that there's now less agreement on the big questions of 1609 in philosophy than there is on the big questions of 1609 in physics. This takes into, the thought is even taking into account that phenomenon. If there's been some agreement, if there are one or two big questions of philosophy in 1609 that have attracted convergence, say questions about space and time, the claim is, nevertheless, there's still more disagreement on the big questions from 1609 in philosophy than there is in physics. If that's right, then there's something more here that needs to be explained. Furthermore, I think, even if this is right, that philosophy is by its nature dealing with questions on which there's not disagreement, one can still raise the explanatory question, what is it about those questions that makes them the questions on which there is this kind of disagreement? I mean, I suppose you could take the view it's just a random process, and all questions are equally susceptible to convergence, and some of them we just converge on faster and some slower, and the ones we happen to have been slower on, those are the ones we're still calling philosophy. I don't think that's a terribly plausible diagnosis in this situation. So about those questions on which there happens to be disagreement, the mind-body problem, free will, and whatever, I think one can actually raise the questions, what is it about them that makes them count as, that makes them susceptible to this lack of convergence, and therefore to count as philosophy by this diagnosis? That explanatory question doesn't go away. There's also sociological factors. Many people want to appeal to sociological factors in thinking about these questions. It's like, well, some of us, maybe some people do know the truth, but sociological factors have prevented others from agreeing. I mean, I think it's part of the phenomenology of many people doing philosophy with their own arguments and their own views. This is precisely what's going on. I've gotten to the truth. I know the truth, but my benighted opponents, they're all under the influence of, maybe they're under the influence of some major philosophical tradition, like their advisor studied with Quine, as it were, or they're so invested in that form of materialism on which they published all these books, or they'd lose their membership of the card-carrying panpsychist association if they were to come around to my view or some such. It's very easy to think that, obviously sociological factors do play some major role in philosophy. At the same time, I think it's, sociological factors also play a very big role in science and in mathematics and so on. Despite those sociological factors, one finds this kind of agreement. If one finds this level of agreement, these differing levels of convergence in philosophy compared to the sciences, that's going to be something which requires some explanation. So I have a hard time thinking this is all that's going on here. So my own view is that none of these explanations provide a full explanation of the lack of convergence on the big questions of philosophy. In a way, none of them get at these questions. It's just something hard about these questions. There's something very hard that makes them very difficult to settle. And none of these are quite getting at that hardness. But then the question is, well, what does explain that hardness? And are there better explanations? I'm not sure of the answer to that question, but it goes along with the question of, is more progress possible? Is the lack of progress and the lack of convergence in philosophy a temporary phenomenon, or is it permanent? Is it just a relative slowness, or is it something that runs deeper than that? Might we eventually obtain collective knowledge of the answers to the big questions of philosophy? And are the answers even knowable in principle? by some beings. Even if we humans are not smart enough, could some beings know the answers to these questions? My own view is here is that, now just very briefly getting into my own first order philosophical views, actually my own meta-philosophy is at some level optimistic. And I've argued in a book that came out last year, Constructing the World, for a certain kind of knowability thesis about all truth, including philosophical truths. That all truths are a priori entailed by certain fundamental empirical truths about the world. You take the fundamental properties of nature and the fundamental laws of nature and the initial conditions and so on, and arbitrary, ideal, a priori reasoning from there, then in principle, you ought to be able to know all truths. So if someone can know the fundamental empirical truths and reason ideally, this should get them to know all the truths. So you might think of that as a kind of a thesis of ideal optimism. But then, of course, we are not ideal in all the relevant respects, so it doesn't yet get us to human optimism. I mean, there's still going to be many sources of disagreement, even consistent with this optimistic view. On some questions, I mean, it says that the truths are all scrutable in the sense the truths are all a priori entailed by fundamental empirical truths. On questions where there's no fact of the matter, about which we're anti-realists, then there'll be no truths there to know. Sometimes it'll turn out that individuals will be able to know the truths via this method, but verbal disputes or sociology will get in the way of others agreeing with you. Maybe they mean different things by key terms, or other people are non-ideal, so they don't converge. Sometimes, often, we're empirically ignorant. We don't know all the relevant empirical facts for knowing these truths, and sometimes our reasoning is non-ideal. And I think this last one is actually perhaps the most relevant of all of this. Even if ideal reasoners could figure all this stuff out, we are not, as humans, ideal reasoners, and this imposes serious limitations. So I think many of the hardest cases fall into the last category. Knowable by ideal reasoning, but not yet known, but not known by us. And this raises the question, which I alluded to a moment ago, well, are the problems humanly unsolvable or humanly solvable and just unsolved? So Colin McGinn has famously advocated the view that some of the big questions of philosophy, like the mind-body problem, are just beyond us. We're not smart enough. We didn't evolve to do philosophy. And he leaves it open that some other beings, Martians who did evolve to do philosophy, might be in a position to solve them, but we can't. The other alternative, though, is that they're humanly solvable and just unsolved. One day we'll be able to solve them with enough discipline and enough insight. I suppose there are intermediate positions, which is maybe we can't solve them, but our successors will solve them. There are people who think about the singularity, the period when we can construct machines. We get to the point where we can construct machines that are smarter than we are, and they construct machines which are smarter in turn, and they construct machines that are smarter in turn. You get a rapid spiral towards superintelligence. Sometimes people see that as a pessimistic scenario, but the optimistic spin on this scenario is, okay, if we're not in a position to solve the mind-body problem or any of the other big questions of philosophy, all we need to do is construct our superintelligent machine successors, and once we get to the point of the singularity, they will solve all the philosophical problems for us. I don't know whether everyone's going to see that as such a sunny scenario, but that's one way that one might eventually get there. In any case, so this is the salient question for now. This is itself. I mean, these questions about philosophical progress are themselves philosophical questions, and this is itself a semi-empirical philosophical question. Are the problems humanly unsolvable or humanly solvable and just unsolved? And I think the fact is we don't know the answer to that question now, and I think we have to take the attitude that both possibilities are open. We don't have strong reason to exclude either answer. We're not in a position to exclude the answer, to exclude the possibility that these questions are solvable by humans eventually, and it will eventually have collective knowledge. I think we're also not in a position to exclude the possibility they're not, and will never have collective knowledge. Right now, we don't have strong reason to exclude either answer. So that gets me then to my conclusion, which is a glass half full conclusion. Underneath all this glass half empty stuff, I've always been a glass half full kind of guy, so I can't help but end on an optimistic note, even if it's a little bit strained. If we don't know which of these options obtain, I think to do philosophy, we can make the working assumption that it's the second, that the problems are solvable, but as yet unsolved. After all, we're still learning to do philosophy well. We're non-ideal creatures. We haven't, I think, yet reached the limits of our potential in reasoning and philosophy or anything else. We just have to keep doing philosophy and see where it leads. So that's my glass half full conclusion. Thanks very much.